Sesame Street has been educating and entertaining children all around the world for nearly half a century, and the cast of colourful furry monsters have become beloved icons for generations of kids. The show is based on a heavily researched curriculum and uses humour, music and animation to teach kids not only basic language and math skills, but also personal and societal issues such as death, race and emotional intelligence. It's this winning formula that's responsible for Sesame Street's long-standing success, and it's how it survived funding cuts, controversy, a changing media landscape and Katy Perry. Most recently, the show's gained attention for the introduction of Julia, a Muppet with autism aimed at creating awareness about the condition with children. Personally, I don't see what the big deal is. Sesame Street has been full of characters with mental issues for decades, from anxiety disorder, to attention deficit disorder, to addiction, Alzheimer's disease, anger management issues, obsessive compulsive disorder, and of course the schizophrenia afflicting whoever's been hallucinating all this the entire time. But today I want to take a closer look at one character in particular. No, not Elmo. If you want a closer look at him, I suggest you strip the fur off a Tickle Me Elmo doll. No, I'm talking about one of the more overlooked characters, Mr. Snuffleupagus, known more commonly as Snuffy, presumably because of his obvious drug problem, although with a nose like that I suppose it was inevitable really. Mr. Snuffleupagus is a large brown furry creature who bears a resemblance to the woolly mammoth, only without tusks or visible ears. He comes from a species known as the Snuffleupagus, not Snuffleupagus. It's a children's show. That's right, he's named after what he is. But so what? I know plenty of people named Human. Snuffy made his debut on Sesame Street on November 8th, 1971, when he randomly showed up to help Big Bird water his garden with his long trunk, or Snuffle, beginning what would become a strong and lasting friendship. His physical appearance was quickly changed when it was discovered that his smacked-out yellow eyes frightened children. Now, despite the makeover, at first Big Bird was the only one to actually see the Snuffleupagus, and struggled to convince any of the adults that he actually existed. Every time he'd show up and Big Bird went to get his friends, Snuffy would piss off somewhere, presumably to buy more drugs, leaving Big Bird to look like a bit of a dick. Because why would anyone living on a street with giant talking birds and various other sentient creatures made of shag carpeting believe there was a talking elephant hanging around? They were actually pretty harsh about it too.
Imaginary treasure in an imaginary cave with your imaginary friend.
They sure you don't need an imaginary dime to call your imaginary friend?
There's no such thing as a Snuffleupagus. It's in your imagination.
Well, you could meet him right now if you'll all come.
A big bird?
No.
But finally in 1985, Big Bird, with the help of Elmo, managed to get Snuffy to stay put long enough to introduce him to the grown-ups and prove that he wasn't making the whole thing up. Now, according to Snuffleupagus' performer Martin P. Robinson, and this is true, the decision to have the human cast finally meet Snuffy was due to a string of high-profile and sometimes graphic stories of pedophilia in the news at the time. The writers worried children would think that their parents wouldn't believe them if they were sexually abused and were better off remaining silent. Now that is messed up, but perhaps if another TV personality at the time had learned to keep his hairy brown Snuffle to himself, he might not be in the trouble he's in today. Since then, Mr. Snuffleupagus has become a major part of Sesame Street, teaching everyone the Snuffle Shuffle and introducing us to his baby sister Alice, who their parents obviously put a little more thought into naming. Speaking of which, there was also an episode of Sesame Street in 1992 in which Snuffy's parents got a divorce, most likely over the rift in the family that their son's drug habit had created. The show, however, was scrapped before airing after focus groups showed that small children didn't quite understand the concept of divorce and were confused by the episode. In fact, the subject of divorce wasn't actually brought up on the show again until 20 years later, which is actually closer to the real experience of children of divorced parents, not dealing with it until many years later when the damage is done. Big Bird, meanwhile, pretty much has carte blanche these days to say any old bullshit that comes into his head, and everyone has to give him the benefit of the doubt now. Abkadef is not a word, and you know it's not a word. Anyway, that's it for Pointless Things of History. Join me next time when we take a look back at actor Steve Guttenberg. Who? Exactly.